Welcome to episode 2 of We Been New. This is arc 1, naming the distortion. And I'm currently, I've finished chapter 3, which is titled How We Drifted Away Further from the Truth. Actually, no, I read that last week. It is Education Under Outside Control. All right. And I'm not even gonna hold you. There's a paragraph in here that was a whole sermon. So Woodson says that the unfortunate successors of the Northern missionary teachers, like the ones who came after, have demonstrated no useful function in the life of the Negro. They don't have the spirit of their predecessors. They don't measure up to what real educators should be. And then he says, if Negro institutions are going to be as efficient as the white ones, the same high standard should be maintained for educators who direct them. And then he also goes on to say that Negro schools can't go forward with this load of inefficiency, especially when the white presidents of these institutions are often less scholarly than Negroes who have to serve under them. And when I read that, I was like, yeah, because I cannot tell you how many times, not necessarily in the educational space, but how many times I have had to work under people who, quite frankly, were not at the level that made it appropriate for them to be leading me in the first place. And that's not even about ego. It's about the injustice of it, because when you're being told, this is leadership, this is authority, this is who gets to decide, then you get to see with your own eyes that it's upside down. And then you have to live with the reality. It's this other reality that your trajectory, your livelihood, your education, your access is tied to people who have no business being in these roles whatsoever. And you know you could do better, but you don't have the authority or the power to do anything about it meaningfully. So you're just stuck in it. And I want you to really sit with this. Where in your life have you been made to submit to authority that you knew was misaligned? And what did that teach you about what you deserve? And this is in multiple contexts in terms of people and positions of authority and roles of authority. So it gets into the curriculum of humiliation. And then Woodson he talks about this outside control, what it actually looks like, what it looks like socially. Like this is what's wild. So by law and custom, white presidents and white teachers of Negro schools are prevented from participating freely in the life of the Negro. They occupy an uncomfortable dual position. And then he gives examples that honestly made my stomach turn. He says when he taught in school with a mixed faculty, the white women would bow to him in this patronizing way on campus, but off campus, they didn't see him. Now, read that again. On campus, performing respect. Off campus, you're invisible. And then he says, a white president of one Negro school never entertains a Negro in his home. And if someone does come as a guest, he shifts them to the students' dining room. Another white president maintains a guest cottage on campus that Negroes can only enter as servants. And then another doesn't even allow students to enter his home through the front door. And so Woodson says, Negroes trained under those conditions without protest become downright cowards. And in life, they continue as slaves in spite of nominal emancipation. And you know what? That language is really sharp, but I understand what he's saying because this isn't just disrespect. It is training. This is curriculum. This is instruction through atmosphere and environment. It teaches you exactly where you're supposed to stand. It teaches you what doors you can touch. It teaches you what you're allowed to expect. It teaches you what happens when you forget your place. And if you spend your formative years absorbing that without anyone naming it, without anyone intervening, then yes, you will carry that into adulthood. You will carry it into work. You will carry it into relationships. You will carry that into leadership. You will carry that into your willingness and your unwillingness to confront power. Because when you are conditioned to believe that protest equals danger and submission equals survival, that's what keeps you stuck in that pattern. And the part that keeps hitting me is how much of this was never about education as learning, but actually weaponizing education as containment. And so it makes me wonder, like, what did your environment teach you? Not through textbooks, but through tone, through access, and who was allowed through which door. Like, what did you learn about yourself without anyone ever saying any of that out loud? There is this very, very famous quote that is within this book by Woodson. And it is, if you can control a man's thinking, you do not have to worry about his action. When you determine what a man shall think, you do not have to concern yourself about what he will do. If you make a man feel he is inferior, you do not have to compel him to accept an inferior status, for he will seek it himself. If you make a man think that he is justly an outcast, you do not have to order him to the back door. He will go without being told. And if there is no back door, his very nature will demand one. Mm, mm. And so somebody asked, what kind of method or approach or appeal would one make to the Negro child that can be made just as well by a white teacher? And Woodson says, to be frank, we have to concede there isn't some special body of facts that only Negro students can teach. If a white teacher had the same attitude, the same care, the same relationship, they could present information too. But then he says in most cases, tradition, race hate, segregation, and terrorism make such a thing impossible. And that's the key, because it's not about whether a white person is theoretically capable of teaching, it is about the actual conditions. If you're being taught by people who do not see you as human, people who do not value you, people who see you through a diminished lens, and we already talked about last week how true history, true African, true Black history was not being taught, then what do you think is happening when they teach you? Even if they are imparting information, they are also imparting worldview. They're imparting meaning, and they're imparting the boundaries of your imagination and what you should believe about yourself and your people and your place in the world. And that is why I keep coming back to this. Again, if you can control people's minds, you don't even have to be present to keep them oppressed. Because once this worldview is installed, people will oppress themselves. They will police themselves, and they will turn on each other. They will internalize the lie and they will call it reality. And when you add that to the erasure of the African history, when you add to the deliberate omission and distortion, now you're not just teaching people incomplete history, you are removing the reference point for truth. So you end up with generations of Black boys and Black girls who are being socialized into a very harmful narratives about themselves. And many of them don't even have the wherewithal or the access or the support to even know where to begin looking for what's real. So they're looking everywhere else for what's real. And I think about today, I think about how I'm thankful for the digital age, even though it is overwhelming, because I can access information. I can study. I can cross reference. I can re educate myself because I am curious and I am critical and I am willing to seek. But not everybody has that. Everybody doesn't get that. Not everybody has time for that. Not everybody has safety for that. And not everybody realizes that they even need it. And that's honestly why I'm even doing all of this. But it starts right here. Formative years being shaped by people and systems that were never built to affirm your humanity. And that is something that it was being called out by Carter G. Woodson in 1933, but that is still true today. And we are seeing that it is becoming even more true as more is being done to remove truth and real history from our school systems. So then I ask, what belief about yourself or your people did you inherit through school that you now recognize wasn't even neutral? And do you even realize that it was conditioning? So I'm going to continue on. Woodson says something that to me is foundational. He says the emphasis is not upon the necessary for separate systems, but for the need for common sense schools and teachers who understand and continue in sympathy with those whom they instruct. And when he clarifies that what the real issue is those who disagree with the idea that education is merely a process of imparting information. And for me, that line right there is the fracture. Because if you believe that education is just information transfer, then you don't have to think about relationship. You don't have to think about worldview. You don't have to think about how information lands in the body. And you don't even have to think about how it shapes identity. You just say, well, the facts are the facts. But the facts are never neutral when they are delivered inside of hierarchy. And this is where my mind goes to understanding an Afrocentric worldview, an introduction to optimal psychology by Dr. Linda James Woodson. Not Linda James Woodson, Dr. Linda James Myers. This is actually the book that really put me onto Woodson in the first place, because in this text, there's this emphasis on Ubuntu. I am because we are. On wholeness, on the inseparability of mind, body, spirit, community, and land, something that our people knew thousands years ago. Okay. Everything is connected. Education is not separated from the spirit. It is not separate from the nervous system. It is not separate from your sense of belonging. It is not separate from your ability to imagine a future. So when Woodson says education should begin with life as people find it and help them to make it better, I understand that to know that that is not a sentimental statement, but that is a structural necessity. And if you begin with people's lived reality, then education becomes adaptive and it becomes responsive, and more important, it becomes empowering. But if you begin with European ancients who were imitating the ancient Africans, Egyptians, Kemet, Ethiopians, um, and even the imitations of those Europeans who were imitating what they saw. If you begin with a worldview that has already been fragmented, from that has already fragmented self, from spirit, individual from community, land from people, then what you are teaching isn't neutral at all. You are teaching distortion. And I know that we're not in the book Yurugu yet, an African-centered critique of European thought and behavior, but I already see where this is going, because that book gets into the psychological processes that had to occur for Europe to be known as for it to become Europe as we know it. Um, Objectification, separation, fragmentation, the splitting of self, the splitting of reality into compartments. And what I'm now recognizing is that fragmentation didn't just stay in philosophy, it entered into education that has been so diabolically um, weaponized. Now education becomes memorize this, regurgitate that, chase this credential, increase your salary, because that's really the through line. And nowhere in that process are you asked Is your life more harmonious? Is your community more whole? Is your spirit more integrated? Is your people's condition any better? And that's not even a metric. That is performance inside of a structure that was never designed with your liberation in mind, because your liberation is antithetical to that system. And when you take a step back and you look at that, you start to see that miseducation isn't just about false history. It is about teaching people to value the wrong outcomes. It is about conditioning them to pursue proximity instead of sovereignty, and convincing them that success equals separation. And the saddest part, a lot of us don't even realize that we're being trained into it. Um, so I ask this question: does education bring your mind into harmony with the life you actually have to face? Or does it prepare you to perform inside of a system that we all are seeing with our very eyes are not built for anyone? Well, we know who it's built for, but it is not built for humanity. So when Woodson says something that uh, says education means to inspire people to live more abundantly and to begin with life as they find it and make it better, that is objectively true, right? But again, when you are taught within a system where the worldview is abundance means domination, extraction, all of these things that have been used to create this society, then you can see where people would mistakenly, um, they would mistakenly equate education with, actually, I'm going to get into it because he says in most cases, graduates have merely increased the number of malcontents who offer no program for changing the undesirable conditions about which they complain. And that line hit me because what he's saying is protest by itself is not transformation. Complaint by itself is not liberation. If you do not have a constructive program, if you don't know what you are building toward, then all you are doing is reacting inside of the same structure. And here is the dangerous part. If people don't even know that they are being miseducated, if they don't even recognize that their worldview has been shaped by something unnatural, then they won't even know that they need a program. And they'll think that the system is flawed, but it just needs to be repaired. It just needs reform. But it's fundamentally valid, right? They'll think, oh, if I just work harder, if I just get one more credential, if I just get into this room, or if I just get closer to power, it's just going to magically make all those problems disappear. But Woodson is exposing something deeper, and that is that the foundation itself is distorted. And I think about like the principles of Ma'at: harmony, balance, justice, responsibility, reciprocity. I don't remember that ever being the center of my education, not in K through 12, not in college, both times, not even in corporate leadership development. There was no conversation about alignment. No conversation about moral coherence. No conversation about what it means to create order instead of enforcing order by extracting profit. And when you do not teach that, you create generations of people who are technically skilled but spiritually fragmented. And then we wonder why everything feels chaotic. We have allowed ourselves to build on a lie for decades, centuries. And when you build on something that is fundamentally dishonest, when you build on erasure, exploitation, and distortion, eventually the cracks show. Eventually the glass is going to have to break. And that's what this moment that we're all living in, that's what it feels like to me. It feels like rupture. because you cannot be the hero and the villain at the same time. You cannot claim democracy while practicing domination. You cannot preach equality in design systems that cap certain people's advancement by design. And so now we're at this crossroads. Everything feels so broken. It feels like the only thing left to do is to burn it down and to start fresh. And this is what a lot of people are afraid of. If you start fresh, where will you begin? And that's why I was very, very intentional about the ordering of the books that we will be reading, because don't worry, I will be getting into the arc on what liberation actually looks like. But, the thing is, you've got to ask, what is your source of truth? Who do you trust to define what aligned humanity actually looks like? Because if you spent centuries erasing the true origins of balance and harmony, if you discredited the descendants of the very people who practiced it, and then you've replaced it with these superficial markers of, you know, um, who you should listen to, then you don't have a shared foundation anymore. You have power struggles. You have fear. You have people clinging to a system that's cracking because they don't know what replaces it. And the dominant culture especially cannot afford to admit to this lie, because to admit it would mean relinquishing control of the narrative. It would mean admitting that you have been both architect and beneficiary of distortion. And that is why the resistance to truth is so aggressive. It is not confusion, it is preservation. And reading Woodson in 2026, seeing him say these things in 1993 feels like watching someone call out a blueprint that we are still living inside of, which I know is not coincidental. I know that this is design. And so when Woodson says something he says something that feels eerily familiar. He talks about how Negroes who think like he does, who dare to say these things, are branded as opponents of interracial cooperation. And I know that all too well, because it wasn't even until summer of 2020 that we were even allowed to speak really on race, that we were even actually calling out the elephant in the room. So I think about, like, um, how many times have I heard that? If you critique the structure, you're divisive. If you name the imbalance, you're anti cooperation. If you refuse tokenism, you're difficult. In fact, I specifically remember one of the Black professionals that I interviewed last year for my treatise, and how people wanted to use her in imagery. And she was like, "You're going to have to get somebody else to do it." And they were so perplexed as to why she didn't want to be a representative, knowing that this was just optics, but she was considered difficult. Um, so Woodson clarifies what cooperation actually means. And I think through this journey, it's also where I'm realizing we have got to reclaim language, because everything that we are taught, or everything that we are shown, there is this cognitive dissonance that is built in. So it ends up disrupting and distorting what the true meaning of words are. So cooperation implies equality of the participants in the particular task at hand. But what he describes is not equality. He says the usual way is for whites to work out their plans behind closed doors, get them approved by a few Negroes serving nominally on a board, and then employ a white or mixed staff to carry out the program. And he says it plainly. This is not interracial cooperation. It is the ancient idea of calling upon the inferior to carry out the orders of superior. And when I read that, I immediately thought about DEI, because I will never forget, this was several years ago when I was considering applying for a role in that space. And at that time, I was only just becoming aware of the language of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so was the organization I was in. Again, this was before 2020. Actually, no, this was around the time of 2020. But even with limited exposure, I could already see that something wasn't right. The goals were not aspirational, they were comfortable. increase Black leadership representation by, increase the number by 5%. Mind you, prior to this time, there had never even been a disclosure of the percentages of Black leadership. I just knew with my own eyes that I didn't see Black leadership. So it's like, okay, increase the representation by 5%, but 5% of what? If Black leadership is less than 3% or less than 1% in a lot of spaces, what are we even talking about? One more higher, maybe? And then I started thinking structurally. Okay, if I take this role, I report to HR. HR reports to the CEO, but the head of DEI doesn't report directly to the CEO. And I'm not going to get into it in this episode, but again, thinking about who traditionally makes up executive leadership and heads of HR. And that tells me everything, because it means whatever initiatives we propose, whatever objectives and key results that we outline, they have to exist at the comfort level of the dominant white leadership. Not at the level of justice, not at the level of repair, not even in the level of truth, at the level of comfort. And once I understood that, I had to ask myself, is there even a point? Because if the job description says enhance diversity, address injustice, improve equity, then that requires honesty. That requires boldness, that requires risk, that requires dismantling patterns that benefit the very people you are reporting to. But if the structure itself ensures that your progress is capped, if you can only go so far as leadership's comfort allows, then the function is inherently stunted. And this is exactly what Woodson is describing. Plans made behind closed doors, approved by a few token representatives, and tokens get spent, by the way, executed within boundaries that protect the dominant group. So this is not cooperation. This is containment. And here's the part that hit me hardest. He says, behind closed doors, these so-called friends say you need to be careful advancing Negroes to commanding positions unless it can be determined beforehand that they will do what they are told. You can never tell when some Negroes will break out and embarrass their friends by advocating equality or demanding democratic privileges. And that was in 1933. And yet, how often do we still see this? Looking at all these philanthropic efforts and organizations that care about the community, care about righting wrongs, care about Black people. Yet, with this administration, even if not told to do so, where the money at? Where the grants at? Where the funds at? Where the support at? So you can be promoted if you don't disrupt. You can have influence if you don't challenge the foundation. You can speak if you stay within the approved vocabulary. But the moment you demand structural change, the moment you name power, the moment you connect the dots too quickly, now you're a problem. And what I realized even before I had all of this language for it is that I was sensing that dynamic in real time. Nobody was saying it out loud, but I could feel it in my body. I knew that it was there. And that recognition, that early awareness, that is part of what pushed me deeper into studying all of this in the first place. Because once you see the structure, you cannot unsee it. And Woodson is making it painfully clear. Again, this is not accidental. This is architectural. So I ask, where do you see cooperation in your workplace or community that is really just control with better branding? So then Woodson moves on into something that further called me out. This is chapter 5, the failure to learn to make a living. And he opens it with this. Whew. The greatest indictment of such education as Negroes have received, however, is that they have thereby learned little as to making a living, the first essential in civilization. And when I read that, I had to pause, because what he's pointing out is not just employment, but it is actually economic sovereignty. It is the ability to create, to sustain, to employ one another, to build something that doesn't collapse. the moment that outside approval is withdrawn. And he says it plainly: Negroes are unable to employ one another, and whites only call on Negroes after their own race has been taken care of. And now we see him with the AI, like, we see what's happening with that. And the miseducated Negro has offered no remedy. And that's harsh, but I understand what he means. If your education does not bring your mind into harmony with the life you must actually face and your people, then you are technically trained but structurally unprepared. And I think about degrees. I think about the doctorate story that he tells, the man who needed the degree for promotion, but couldn't even pronounce what he was chasing, because again, you've now connected education in that sense with this is my means for surviving versus like being educated to be to really come into full self-knowledge, which is the basis of all knowledge, and to come to full enlightenment, right? So the degree wasn't about scholarship, it was about salary. And Woodson makes it clear he is not against advanced degrees, but they should be honors that are earned for distinction, not keys to a higher paycheck inside a system that still caps your influence. And when I sit with that, I have to be honest. How much of what we chase is rooted in fear? If I do this, maybe I won't suffer. If I get this title, I'll be safe. If I collect enough credentials, maybe I will be insulated from the financial insecurity that I was born into and that I continue to struggle in through my early adulthood. And again, what are we even being insulated from? From a system that was designed to keep you dependent. Because if you're being educated into pipelines that were never structured to fully receive you in the first place, if you're being taught to integrate into industries that were never built with your advancement in mind, then you are not being prepared for ownership. You are being prepared for participation at best. And those are not the same thing. And Woodson gets into something that hurts even more. He talks about Black people refusing to invest in Black enterprises, exploiting them without supporting them, gossiping them into failure, expecting them to fail, and then celebrating when they do, just so that they could say, I told you so. And that part is heavy because he is not just critiquing the oppressor, he is naming internalized distortion. If you've been taught that Black business is inherently inferior, if your professors told you years ago that Black people can't compete, you're not even seeing examples of Black success, then you will unconsciously sabotage your own. And here's the part that got personal for me. He talks about failure, about how Black businesses often don't have room to fail. And I had to unpack something within myself. When I first joined a new team years ago, the philosophy was fail fast, try it. If it doesn't work, adjust. No big deal. And that concept was foreign to me because I have never felt afforded the privilege of failure. For me, there was no try, there was only do. There was only, you better get this right. And whether that narrative was always objectively true or not, it was true in my nervous system. Because when you understand that mistakes can be weaponized against you, when you understand that your competence is constantly being evaluated, not just as an individual, but as a representative, and then you have no safety nets, then failure doesn't even feel like growth. It just feels like a risk that you cannot afford. And that conditioning, it shapes how you move. It shapes your aversion to starting small. It shapes your hesitation to experiment. It shapes your fear of building something that is imperfect. And Woodson says something that connects directly to this. He says the educated Negro often cannot start small enterprises that make larger ones possible. If he cannot proceed according to the methods of gigantic corporations he reads about or works within, he does not know how to organize communities of the poor along lines of small business. And that really hurt because I was trained in corporate structures, in banking and operational efficiency and scaling systems, but I wasn't trained in food supply chains for my community, in cooperative models, and building from the ground up with limited capital. And what I'm recognizing now is that corporate conditioning teaches you to optimize inside systems, but not to actually reimagine the system itself. And so when I stepped into entrepreneurship, really stepped into it, I had to confront that. I had to confront how much of my thinking is still shaped by the very structures I critique. Um, And Woodson says the educated Negro businessman is sometimes doing the impossible precisely because he hasn't internalized the propaganda that says it can't be done. And that is wild because sometimes overeducation inside can, a distorted system can actually limit imagination more than lack of formal schooling. And if we're being honest, that is still very true. And I'm going to pause right here because I actually need to go help facilitate for our Safe Black Space monthly healing circle. So I'll come back to this. All right, so just got back from the Safe Black Space healing circle and also successfully leading my first self-care, loving kindness meditation, which that was a beautiful experience. And I'm so thankful that I got to serve in that capacity. And even though I wish I could have recorded this in one shot, I'm just so thankful that I get to be living and learning this work at the same time. So I'm going to get into chapter 6, and it's titled "The Educated Negro Leaves the Masses." And this is where it gets even more uncomfortable. So Woodson says the more educated Negroes became, the further they strayed from the churches. The gap between the masses and the talented tenth widened. And then he asks, how can an educated Negro leave the church of his people and accept Jim Crowism? He says maybe it's a kind of slave psychology, a preference for the leadership of the oppressor. And that's really sharp because when I sit with that, I don't actually hear that as condemnation. I hear that as diagnosis. He's saying, wake it up. Because if you've been trained to associate whiteness with progress, refinement, safety, advancement, correctness, then proximity starts to feel like evolution, and distance from your people starts to feel like elevation. But that's just distortion. And I had to be honest with myself here because I remember being in a relationship sometime around 2012, 2013, and it was with someone who was an activist. And we had some pretty passionate arguments. This was around the time that I started making more money. I'm staying in a penthouse suite in downtown LA. I'm renting out my first home. So from all the markers of Western society, I'm successful. I've got all kinds of things going together there. And this gentleman that I was dating, his situation was a little bit different. And he felt some type of what it's weird. And that's a whole other conversation and getting into, I'm not even gonna go there. But at any rate, he felt like I was abandoning my community, that I was selling out. And my response back then was, what community? Because I had been raised separate. Um, I was raised by a single mother who intentionally moved us further and further away from the Black and brown neighborhoods, placed us in schools where I could count on one hand how many students looked like me. And I understand why she did it. But at that same time, I was being told implicitly and explicitly to be mindful. And actually, like, as I went into adulthood, I was being told to be mindful of who I associated with, even in the workplace. So this is like childhood through adulthood and my career, and this alienation and this separation and this elevation. And all of that means is just moving away. That is continuing the ma'afa. Ma'afa is the separation, the disruption that happened with the Black Holocaust. I know we don't recognize it. I know it's not widely recognized as a Holocaust, but it was a Holocaust. And so think about that, and then think about in these more modern times, still being told like you've been separated from your people and continue to separate yourself if you want to do well in this society. So when someone said your community, I genuinely didn't know what that meant. I had social circles. I had people that I went out and had fun with. I had acquaintances, but I had not been taught collective responsibility. I had been taught individual escape. And that's a very, very confusing message. You are Black. You will be treated differently, but go over there anyway. Assimilate, excel, outperform. Don't look back. And that creates a fracture because you are simultaneously reminded of your racial identity, but you're also being trained to distance yourself from it. And Woodson is saying that when the educated Negro leaves the masses, it works more disastrously among Negroes than among whites because white lower classes have had more opportunity. And that's the thing that we haven't, uh, I won't say all of us, but I don't think that was something I fully understood. It's like you're being told you could be anything, you can do anything, but the reality is you do not have those same opportunities. Now, I don't know if I fully agree with him saying, because he was saying that educated white people are always working to lift their own. But I do understand what he is observing, and that is that proximity breeds protection and fragmentation breeds vulnerability. And he says, um, at that time, the church was the only institution that the race controls, which is complicated for me being raised as a Buddhist, because religion has been both refuge and weapon, liberation and oppression, and community as well as psychosis in my observations of others, quite frankly. And he goes even further to say that even in the church, Negro religion is largely a loan from the whites who enslaved and segregated them. Borrowed theology, fragmented denominations, too many bishops duplicating the same work, and impoverished people paying for division they didn't even create. And when I read that, I thought about today. I also think about that from like the perspective of online space, kind of the new frontier in control, right? I think about the 5011 Buy Black apps that I've come across, about the constant fragmentation, about how we replicate division instead of consolidating our power. Amazon doesn't have 5011 duplicates competing for the same customers. Although, again, that's another conversation because they're going to make sure they're not going to have no competitors. But there are ways around Amazon. Um, but we know that's strategic consolidation. But we, conditioned by separation, often default to segmentation. Um, because again, if you are socialized and conditioned within a separatist type of society, um, and you have not been taught community, and you're like, I'm going to be the savior, I'm going to solve this problem, and I'm going to be the owner of it. Never mind that, like, if there's someone else who may actually have been able to add a piece to the puzzle that you weren't even thinking of. Um, and that's just so sad to me. And I know that it's not accidental because if you understand how psychology if you understand how to psychologically oppress people, you don't just limit their access, you pattern their behavior. And you teach them to divide, to distrust, to expect failure, to overcompete internally while underinvesting collectively. And the most sobering part of all of this is realizing that I was living inside of that pattern without even knowing it. The separation, the credential chasing, the corporate proximity, the distancing myself from the struggle, that fear of failure, the discomfort with starting small, and the uncertainty around community. Those are all things that I had to live through and had to figure out once my labor identity had been stripped from me. Once all of those things that I've been chasing and moving towards were shown to be not actually within my control. I had to um I had to redefine my identity. I had to redefine my purpose. And so, like, here's what gives me hope, because Sankofa, it means to go back and get what was left behind, whether it be knowledge, whether it be your spirituality, whether it be your ancestral practices, whether it be sense of self. You got to go back and get what was left behind, your history. You know, what excites me now is that there are so many people who have awakened to this distortion. Um, and get this, we have corporate experience. We have operational knowledge now. We understand scale and we understand structure. But now we also understand the lie, and that changes how we build. And because we don't have to replicate what we learned. We can extract what was useful and we can discard what was distorted. We can bring efficiency without dehumanization. We can bring structure without supremacy. And we can bring ambition without separation and competition. So Woodson wasn't just critiquing, he was warning. And almost 100 years later, we are still living in the blueprint that he named. But here is the difference. We can see it now, like for real, we can see it now. And once you see the distortion clearly, the responsibility shifts. Now it is not just about surviving our miseducation, it is about refusing to reproduce it. So I ask you, when you hear community, what do you actually feel? Is it belonging, obligation, resentment, confusion? And dig a little deeper, because who taught you that definition? I thank you for joining me on this second episode of We've Been New. And I'm going to continue reading The Miseducation of the Negro. I had carved out for myself to have this finished by this second episode, but just given all of the things that I am working on right now and really just absorbing what it is that I've been rereading, and continuing to embody as I watch everything that is happening around us. Um, I'm leaning into taking my time and not being worried about sticking to a strict schedule, because I really want to make sure that I finish going through this and just sharing the nuggets, the wisdom, the seeds of wisdom with you, um, and seeing what it sparks for you. So be well. Until next time.